probably one of the most famous passages. It starts out with Genesis chapter 1. I want to touch on some neat stuff here today. Let's look at verse number 7. Genesis 1:27. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God created He, male and female created He them. You know, it's controversial today to say that man and woman, that's marriage. One man, one woman. From the beginning, that's what God has created. That's what God has intended for life. That was the original plan. Look at the next verse. In verse 28, He says, and God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. This is God's purpose for marriage. One man, one woman, for life, together, never separating, and be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth. And if you want God's blessing on your life, I would recommend that you get one spouse and you stay with that one spouse for life. If you go into marriage with that attitude, God blesses it. And what I want to talk about today is polygamy in the Bible. Polygamy in the Bible. And for those that don't know, polygamy means multiple wives. And, we just read that clearly God created cattle first, and then God created man, and God creates woman. And a wife is not cattle. Right? God honors women. God prefers women way above cattle. They are precious jewels. They are precious flowers. In Proverbs 31, He says, who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. God wants us as men to have that same perspective, that one woman, a wife that you can trust, a woman that fears the Lord, she is precious, she is valuable, she's not like cattle, it's not like a horse, it's not like a car, it's not something you should trade up every year and get rid of what God's given you and your blessing. And also, but really what I want to focus on is this concept of polygamy. Because recently I ran into some Mormons that literally said there is a dispensation of polygamy, a time when God ordained that men should have multiple wives, and that is wicked doctrine. And for those that don't know, Mormons teach that after this life, for you to ascend out of the terrestrial plane, past the telestial plane, into the celestial plane, and achieve the highest levels of godhood in the celestial, you must have multiple wives. They say you must be sealed to multiple wives. This is the teachings of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, that literally you must have multiple wives on the earth and be sealed to them to be able to ascend to Godhead. Look, that's strange doctrine. We know that the Mormons are heretics. That's kind of a no-brainer. Not everybody can pinpoint it, but if you just read what they teach, it's pretty clear. And they teach this perversion of the Bible, that there was a dispensation of polygamy, where one man should have many wives, and that was God ordained. But listen, that's not. That is a perversion of what God ordained. We just read Genesis chapter 1, and from the beginning, God said, one man, one wife. That's the way it ought to be. And the Mormons practice this one man, many wives. They also practice polyamory. They practice where one woman can be sealed to 2 or 3 or multiple men at one time. And they call this, we're just sealed for celestial purposes. And, but God calls this whoredom and adultery, perversion and wickedness. That is strange, wicked doctrine. In Matthew 19, Jesus said, have ye not read that He which made them at the beginning made them male and female? Now Jesus is rebuking everybody that's wrong, especially the Mormons in this. And I would say to the Mormons, have ye not read Genesis chapter 1, where in the beginning God didn't make one man and 13 wives. He made one man and one wife, and these two become one flesh. Jesus continues in Matthew 19, He says, for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Stick with your wife. Stay with your wife. You two become one in the eyes of God. Hold on. Cleave to them. He says, wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Or another woman for that matter, or 14 more wives for that matter. And those that want to teach that polygamy is a biblical concept are usually perverted in many different areas of their doctrine. And they do not appreciate the value of a godly wife. They do not see things the way that God sees things, that it ought to be one man and one woman. Go to Genesis 2. And we don't want to omit God's laws by our tradition or by history or by pointing to other men in the Bible, and that's what they often do. Genesis chapter 2, look at verse 18. And the Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. Let's give him 12 wives. Is that what he's? No, it's not good that man should be alone. Jump to verse 23. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. Go to Genesis chapter 4. I want you to understand this concept. When God created it, it was perfect. Just as everything else that He created, when He created it, it was good, it was perfect. And when God made one man with one woman to help that man, God looked at that and said, this is the perfect marriage situation. Anything outside of that is not perfect. And I understand that we live in a fallen world, but it's important for us to teach what the Bible says. And any variation of one man, one woman for life is shameful. It says they were both together and they were naked and they were not ashamed. One man, one woman is not shameful, but anything else in this world is. Divorce is a wicked sin often caused by a selfish person or somebody that's greedy or the abuse, or the result of abuse. And we ought to fight against divorce, and we ought to stand up for marriage and protect marriage. In Genesis 4, I want you to see verse 19. This is the first polygamist in the Bible, verse 19. And Lamech took unto him 2 wives, and the name of one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. Now, right away, we see this is a wicked sin against God's law. God clearly made one man, one wife. Why would this man sin? Well, he was one of the sons of Cain, and Cain obviously did some pretty wicked stuff, had a bad heart toward God's law. Jump ahead to verse 23. And Lamech said unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech. Hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. So now we see he's a wicked murderer, right? And he's one of the sons of Cain. So if he doesn't appreciate the small things, if he doesn't obey the small laws of God about one man, one woman, of course he's not going to obey the bigger ones about not murdering somebody. Look at verse 24. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. Go to Genesis 16. This guy proclaims his own judgment. He says, I murdered somebody, and so what? If you avenge him on me, you'll be avenged 77 times. This guy was full of pride, and he's trying to make up his own rules, saying he can do what he wants and get away with it. But that's not right. God's laws were clear from the beginning. It's always been that way. One man, one woman. That was His law of marriage. And Lamech, he broke the law, and we need to stand up for what's right. People will point to that and say, well, see, it's in the Bible, therefore God allowed it. Yeah, but God didn't allow this man to marry 2 wives. He didn't allow for this man or determine for this man specifically to be a murderer or even to get away with murder, but this man in his own pride made these statements as if it's okay. But when it contradicts God's law, we know it's not okay. You're going to Genesis chapter 12. Abraham is usually somebody that they'll point to and say, well, Abraham had multiple wives, so therefore it's okay for me to do it. But most of you know in Genesis chapter 12, while Abraham was of the age of 75 years old, God promised him a son, and it was kind of a long time, and he didn't have a son. He dwelt for 10 years, we're going to see, and it's kind of a test of faith. What happened? You're in Genesis 16. Let's start in verse number 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. So she has a servant maid, a girl. Her name's Hagar. And what's she do? Verse 2, and Sarai said unto Abram, behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. Now that part she had right. He said, I pray thee, go in unto my maid. Now that part is wrong. And it may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Now here he sinned by listening to her advice and going into the maid. He sinned by listening to her voice and disobeying God's law on marriage. Look at verse 3. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. So now all of a sudden there's a second wife. And again, I want you to understand here, this is what the Bible would call a concubine. It is marriage. Some people say concubine is not a wife. That's not really accurate according to the scriptures, and we'll see that briefly here. But she is called a wife right here in this introduction. She was the maid. He already had a wife. She became a second wife or a lesser wife. The New Testament tells us she is the bondwoman. There was the free woman. She of her own free will chose to be married to Abraham, right? Well, the bondwoman didn't really have a say in the matter, did she? Did you see them stopping and asking Hagar for her opinion? It was kind of like, well, you're in our service, and here's what we want you to do. Look at verse 4. And he went unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Right away, you break God's law, what happens? There's strife. There's problems. There's troubles. When you go against God's law, things don't work out well for you. So here she's a concubine now. She's a servant wife, essentially. And sometimes concubines in the Bible were either sold into debt or bought out of bondhood, or maybe they were captives from a war. The men were annihilated and there were women and children that were left. And, I believe God's merciful and He protects women and children even in situations like that, even if they're taking into, what we call slavery or servanthood at this time. But understanding that being a bondwoman, she was less authority than the free woman, right? The master was Abraham, his wife was Sarai, and then she had a helper, a handmaid, that now became higher than the rest of the maids because she became a wife, but she's still a bondwoman. She didn't have a lot of say in it, and so she's greater than just a maid, but still less authority than the first wife. Look at verse number 15 in this chapter. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. I want you to jump to Genesis chapter 29 now. So here all of a sudden he has a son, and you know the rest of the story. Eventually the other son comes, but there's always strife. There's problems in the family between the brothers and the sisters and the different lineages, the different lines here, because things were done out of order. Because they did not respect God's commandment about one man, one wife, it caused a ripple effect, a chain reaction of problems down the line. When things are out of order, when things are against God's law, it doesn't go well. Now, sometimes God is merciful and He spares lives through this process. There's no reason that Ishmael should have to die or not have someone to take care of him in that regard. There's no reason for Hagar to have been treated rudely by Sarai. You see, it was her own sin that caused that, and then what happens? Then she gets upset. And a lot of times that's what happens when somebody's in the flesh. They do the wrong thing, and it causes problems. And then them trying to make it right, they do more damage and more wrong. But again, God is merciful. God spared her life and protected her and gave her a great many sons, that came through that lineage. And now we're Genesis 29. I want to look at another one that's often pointed to justify polygamy, even though God does not justify polygamy. Listen, if there was a verse, and it clearly said from God, a man may take up to 4 wives. Well, then there wouldn't be much debate, now would there? Because everybody could say, well, what about that verse where God said, hey, you can have 1 wife, 2 wives, 3, 4. Well, there are verses all throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament, that say 1 wife, 1 man, 1 wife, 1 spouse for life. That's God's plan. But when men sin, when they do things wrong, and we have an account of it in the Bible, that doesn't justify you pointing at their sin to justify you doing the same sin. You understand what I'm saying? You can't point at your neighbor at work and say, well, he cusses and drinks and smokes and does all these wicked things and gets away with it, so it's okay for me to do a little bit of this. No, you don't know when his payment will come due. And you don't know how God's dealing with him. Hey, he might not even be a son of God. He might be a bastard and therefore without the chastening of the Lord. And even if you looked at another Christian and say, well, I know this Christian and he did this and that and got away with it. Well, maybe he didn't get away with it, right? You never know what's really going on. But in the flesh, we like to judge unrighteously and be greedy ourselves and be a little bit selfish about things. And anybody that says the Bible teaches it's okay to have more than one wife, they're usually a greedy, selfish person. They're usually twisting other very important doctrines. So here we're going to look at Jacob, or Israel, how he ended up having 4 wives, but he didn't go searching for 4 wives. He sought after one. Look at verse number 20. Genesis 29, verse number 20. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days, for the love he had to her. And Jacob said unto Laban, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. And Laban gathered together all the men in one place, and made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter, and brought her to him, and he went in unto her. You see what happened? He was supplanted. He was deceived. He didn't get what he wanted, what he was promised. He was lied to. Look at verse 24. And Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah, his maid, for an handmaid. So daddy takes his servant girl, Zilpah, and he gives it to his daughter, Leah. Zilpah now becomes the servant of Leah. Verse 25, and it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. He woke up and he's like, whoa, this isn't my wife. This isn't who I wanted to marry. This isn't who I was promised to be married. He wakes up in the morning and he's like, whoa, it's Leah. And he said unto Laban, what is this thou hast done unto me? Did not I serve with thee for Rachel? Wherefore then hast thou beguiled me? Well, you cheated me, you tricked me, you lied to me, you deceived me and gave me the wrong wife. Now, he didn't want her as a wife. He didn't love Leah. He wanted somebody else. Look at verse 26. And Laban said, it must not be so done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week. And we will give thee this also for the service which thou shalt serve with me yet 7 other years. He says, well, in our country, we give you the one sister before the other sister. Well, if that's true, which I don't think it is, it's clear he was beguiling and lying. If that really was the tradition in that country, it doesn't make it God's law. It doesn't make it right to multiply wives. Verse 28, and Jacob did so and fulfilled her week, and gave him Rachel, his daughter, to wife also. And Laban gave to Rachel his daughter Bilhah, his handmaid, to be her maid. And he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. And when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Because God had mercy on Leah, because Leah was not wanted. She was put in the wrong position. God said, you know what? I'm still going to be merciful to her. I'm going to open up her womb. And Jacob, all he could think about, I want Rachel. And he was deceived. Obviously, this was a wrong situation, but God is still here protecting the innocent. Jump to Genesis chapter 30. Look at verse number 1. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said unto Jacob, give me children, or else I die. Look, when you're married to 2 women, there's envy. There is envy. I was talking with somebody this week, and he was buying something for his ex-wife, and there's strife with her husband, and he's taking care of the ex-wife still, and there's all this, and it's like, well, that's what you get. That's what happens when you take what God has put together and you tear it apart and you destroy it. Then there's envy and strife and there's bitterness and there's all these troubles that come with it. And listen, if you're divorced, I'm not down on you. If you've got 2 wives, now I might be down on you if you are, but the point of this sermon is to help you understand God created something perfect, and the world wants to tear that apart, wants to make it valueless and unimportant. But it's our job as Christians to teach the Bible. And here you see Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, give me children, or else I die. She had this envy. Well, they're having children, and I'm not. Well, that's not right. Envy isn't good. Look at verse 2. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in God's stead? At least he knew his place. He said, look, it's not me that's preventing you from having children. It's clearly God. He said, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. So what's the fruit of envy here? Well, here, you've got 2 wives, and I'm envious of wife number 1, and I'm wife number 2. I know the fix. Let's take wife number 3, and I can take credit for wife number 3 because she's my servant. You follow it? Oh, man, this sounds like a soap opera, right? This is, oh, man. You know, well, one of the ladies in the church who dealing with a lot of kids said something to the effect of, oh, I just need a handmaid. And the husband said, you don't know what that means. No, we're not doing that. Not bringing one into the house. You don't know what you're asking for. It would cause envy and strife. And look, I know we all need help at different times, but God has designed one man and one woman to stay together for life, and that's beautiful. And look, we're going to have enough trials and tribulations on this earth. Let's not add to it. Let's not add a concubine to the mix. You know what I mean? It would only make things worse. So in here, verse 3 says, behold, Bilhah, right? Look at verse 4. And she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife. And Jacob went in unto her. Now, is Bilhah called a wife here? Yes or no? Yes. She is called a wife. Why am I asking this? I want you to understand, in Genesis 35, it says, Reuben went in and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. So biblically, what is the definition of a concubine? A wife, a second wife, a third wife, a servant, a handmaid that has become a wife. Is that God's original plan? No, it's not. God did not design one man and one concubine. No, it's one man and one wife, and anything other than that, she's called a concubine. And she is lesser in the pecking order, and it's not good. It only causes problems. So even though we see it in these stories, that certain men had other wives, that doesn't mean that a lady is like cattle. Well, I multiplied wives, I multiplied cattle, I multiplied riches. No, God is down on all those things. God doesn't want us to be greedy and selfish because you're only going to hurt other people. And that's what ends up happening. Look at verse 5. And Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. She called his name Naphtali. Now, okay, that's still not her son. That's Bilhah's son. But in her pride and her envy, she was deceiving herself. Look at verse 9. When Leah saw that she had left off bearing, what did she do? Well, she fought fire with fire. It says, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob to wife. Now he's got 4 wives. Oh man, this is not what God designed. This is not what God intended. Go to Exodus 21. God's plan was always to have one man, one woman for life. As you're going to Exodus 21, I want you to understand we cannot justify sin by pointing to what others have done in history. We cannot say, well, the tradition of the fathers is this, therefore we omit the law, right? No, we just go with what God says. And for you, if you're hearing the sound of my voice, understand God wants you to have one spouse. Period. Period. And love them. Don't hate them. Enjoy them. That's a gift from God. Do everything you can to protect them. And don't consider others. Don't let any man or woman put that asunder or tear apart a marriage. But also throughout all this, I want you to understand too that God is merciful to the innocent. And sometimes God preserves life in ways that we don't understand. Sometimes God may have preserved men and women or children through servanthood. I mean, some of the greatest men in the Bible, Daniel and Joseph, they were servants. David started out as just a servant boy, right? And so some people were taken as a servant and God used them for great and mighty things. Others, we don't know their names, they're not bragged on, but their life was preserved and they had children and happiness and true joy in life through servanthood. So understand that, because others, the same people that say God wanted polygamy, they'll say God wanted slavery also. But we don't see that commandment. What we do see are commandments where God says, okay, if you're going to have a servant, put it in these constraints to protect the innocent. You know what I'm saying? And he does the same with concubines. Well, if you're going to have a second wife, it's gotten such a problem now that men were multiplying wives. He says, okay, we need to put some constraints and some laws down so it's clear when you're breaking God's law all the more. You know, I thought about this situation where there's somebody with a drunk dad. It's clear the dad didn't love the Lord. He's a drunk. He verbally abused the children. You know, and we might look at that and say, well, God should just strike that guy down dead. He should just get rid of him. But what if God is preserving that drunk dad so that they don't fall into the hands of a molester? Right? So it's not for us to judge these things and say, well, clearly this guy's a drunk, he hates God, therefore God should strike him down now. That's what I say. Well, but that's not what God says, and God might be protecting the next generation and we don't see it. So those that would scoff and say, well, God clearly didn't, judge harshly on those that multiplied wives, maybe he was still just protecting the children and the things to come. Because even the sin that we see with Jacob and his 4 wives, that wasn't his goal to have 4. He just wanted 1, right? But he deceived, so he was deceived. And then, it's kind of ping pong back and forth. Everybody's doing the wrong thing here. And God used it to create a multitude, the 12 tribes, the 12 patriarchs. And I want you to remember that God protects handmaids and servants and concubines, and women are more delicate, and they're more soft. Men are much more resilient at certain things in life, and we can go through a devastating situation and bounce right back, whereas maybe sometimes ladies are a little bit different. They're tender and they need protection, and God may allow them to be protected and preserved through being under a man maybe they wouldn't protect or pick sometimes. And I just, if somebody's in a situation like that, don't question it. Just follow God, honor God. And, God has used people, and we'll look at a couple of these stories, but I want you to see this in Exodus 21, where God creates a law to protect concubines. Look at Exodus 21, verse 8. If she please not her master, who hath betrothed her to himself, then then shall he let her be redeemed. Now, we're talking about a handmaid, a lady, a girl that was brought into servanthood, whether it be by captive or bought out of debt. But here it says, if he marries her, if he betroths her, then she's becoming redeemed. She's no longer just a servant. It says, to let her be redeemed, to sell her unto a strange nation. He shall have no power, seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. Right? He's saying, listen, as a man that has servants, you can't just take a servant girl and say, she'll be my wife today, and then tomorrow I'll sell her to somebody else. God says, you don't have power to do that. God says, that's wrong. If you take someone to be your wife, they are your wife for life. This is what he's trying to put these boundaries around them, because they had already broken the laws concerning one wife. And so he says, well, now I need to make more laws to show them how I will judge them if they continue to disobey. Look at verse 9. And if he have betrothed her unto his son, again dealing with a maid, a bond servant. If he hath betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. He's saying, a daughter-in-law, essentially. Well, she used to be my servant, then my son married her. She's no longer a servant, she's a free woman that her son married. You understand? Deal with her after the manner of daughters. You don't treat her like a servant, you treat her like your own daughter. That's the concept of daughter-in-law. Verse 10, if he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. Now, people will point at this verse and say, clearly God is saying, take as many wives as you want, but that's not what he's saying. First he said, one man, one woman, and those that were breaking it, he said, you take a bondwoman, a concubine, you are required for life to provide for her. You cannot stop providing. That's what he's saying. If you take another wife, her food, her raiment, her duty of marriage, shall he not diminish. And he's actually not allowing for polygamy. He's trying to prevent abuse here to make sure that the innocent is not harmed. Look at verse 11. And if he do not these 3 unto her, then shall she go out free without money. God says, if you're not going to keep her as a wife, you just let her go. You can't just take somebody and hurt them. Go to 1 Samuel chapter 18. 1 Samuel chapter 18, Many will also point to David and Solomon as excuses to justify polygamy or polyamory or what have you, having multiple wives. And that's not really good either. And we see the judgment of God on the situation when they do that. And I just want to give you a little bit of a brief history of polygamy in the Bible, and also just prop up what God has said, that it should be one man, one woman, forever. If you're not sure, don't get married. If you're married, you better get sure, you better get right, you better learn to love them, you better take care of them, you need to provide everything they need, or God will judge you. You're in 1 Samuel chapter 18. Look at verse number 20. And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. And Saul said, I will give him her, look at this, that she may be a snare to him. Now, is he being honest in this relationship? No, again, you see deceit at the beginning. The foundation of it is deceit, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. He says, I know, I'll get my enemies to hate him, and maybe they'll kill him. He says, wherefore Saul said to David, thou shalt this day be my son-in-law in the one of the twain. He says, you two will become one flesh, and you will be my son-in-law. You'll be just like my son. But his plan was that it would be a snare against David, that it would kill him and destroy him. What a wicked agenda. Look at verse 27. Wherefore David arose and went, he and his men, and slew the Philistines, 200 men. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full tale to the king, that he might be the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, to wife. So, Saul here is actually hurting both his daughter and David in this process by trying to deceive them. And he comes up with some big tale. Well, if he could only just go kill a bunch of the enemy and do this thing, then I would be pleased. So David says, okay. Well, the hand of the Lord was with David, so when he went to do it, he destroyed the enemy. Verse 28, and Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. Jump to 1 Samuel 19. I want you to see verse number 11. As Saul continues to try to kill David, we see the fruit of it here in verse 11. Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. Now, here as he escaped, he may have escaped her father, but I believe he was also running away from his marriage. I believe they were both in sin here. If your wife says, hey, we should just separate for a little while, you should say, no ma'am. You should say, no way. You're coming with me. Let's both go. Let's both run. Let's go on the run together. Let's stay together. Let's fight this thing together. And I believe David was in error by leaving her. I believe she was in error by saying, you should just go. You see, and what happens here? Look at this. Look at verse 13. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster and covered it with cloth. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. Now here she goes lying, right? Look at verse 15. And Saul sent the messengers again to see David, saying, bring him up to me in the bed that I may slay him. And when the messengers were come in, behold, there was an image in the bed with a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster. And Saul said unto Michal, why hast thou deceived me so? So he's saying, whoa, my daughter, why are you deceiving me? Well, you know what? She's already been deceived by Saul. David's been deceived by Saul. He's reaping what he's sown. But look, and he sent away mine enemy that he has escaped. And Michal answered Saul, he said unto me, let me go. Why should I kill thee? Now she turns around and lies to her dad. Do you see the fruit of deception? Now she says, she lies to dad and said, well, he asked to go, but yet she said, why don't you go? And then she says, he threatened to kill me. You see the lies adding up, right? So this is not good. This is not a good marriage situation. I do believe that they were in sin for separating, and had they stayed together and went on the run together, God would have blessed that marriage and it would have prospered, because that's God's original plan. Go to 1 Samuel chapter 25. 1 Samuel chapter 25. That God's plan all along was one man, one woman. And people will point to David's mistakes to try to justify polygamy, and they ignore God's clear law. That's not okay. That is not right. Just because David sinned and got away with it doesn't in any way make it okay in God's eyes. And besides, he didn't really get away with it. You know, there was war in his own house, between his own children, between his wives for the rest of his life. So David knew God's law and he broke it, because in Deuteronomy 17, which was available to him, it says, "But he shall not multiply horses to himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt, to the end that he should multiply horses. For as much as the Lord hath said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Listen, neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver or gold." This commandment in Deuteronomy 17:17 couldn't be any clearer. Do not multiply wives. One wife. Do not add to it and do not multiply. Well, David failed, and we're going to see that. But worse than that, when he failed and justified it, he ended up causing problems for Solomon, who eyewitnessed it. And maybe Solomon said, well, my dad has many wives. Why don't I take more? You understand? The sin just continued. In the next verse, Deuteronomy 17:18, he says, "And it shall be, when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write him a copy of this law in a book, out of that which is before the priests and the Levites." This is literally saying, here's the law of God. David, as a king, was required to write out this law. He read it, he studied it, he knew it, he copied it out. He wrote his own copy of the law so that he could learn it. So he wrote this, he knew this. He knew that he was not supposed to be greedy, not just of horses, but of wives and of gold. And that doesn't mean a wife is just like a horse or gold. No, a wife is so much more. She is so much more important. In 1 Samuel 25, where you're at, we see where Abigail, which was Nabal's wife, had spared innocent lives. David came, and Nabal was a churlish man, it says. He was a rotten guy. He was rude and ugly. And Abigail stepped in and spared a bunch of lives, saved lives. And ultimately, we'll see here that God spared her. I want you to look at verse number 36. 1 Samuel 25, verse number 36. "And Abigail came to Nabal and said, Behold, he held a feast in his house, like the feast of a king, and Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunken. Wherefore she told him nothing, less or more, until the morning light. But it came to pass in the morning, when the wine was gone out of Nabal, and his wife had told him these things, that his heart died within him, and became as a stone." So she revealed to him what she did to spare life and protect against David coming and killing everybody. Verse 38. "And it came to pass about 10 days after, that the Lord smote Nabal, that he died. And when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, Blessed be the Lord that hath pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and hath kept his servant from evil, for the Lord hath returned the wickedness of Nabal upon his own head. David sent and communed with Abigail to take her to him to wife." So Abigail had a good heart. She was married to a wicked guy. She kept doing the right thing, and God protected her and preserved her over time. And God eventually killed her husband, and then David sends for her, right? Look at verse 40. "And when the servants of David were come to Abigail to Carmel, they spake unto her, saying, David sent us unto thee to take thee to him to wife. And she arose and bowed herself on her face to the earth, and said, Behold, let thine handmaid be a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. And Abigail hasted, and arose and rode upon an ass with 5 damsels of hers that went after her, and she went after the messengers of David, and became his wife." Now it's interesting that her life, in essence, is preserved through this, and yet she is the second wife to David, and this is her second marriage. You know, and God is the God of second chances. And God is merciful, and God is understanding, and God protects people more than we'll ever understand. Obviously, that wasn't the perfect situation. But look at verse 43. "David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, that they were also, both of them, his wives." Now here David sinned, right? Because when he took this second wife, she was a widow. She was not in sin. But here David takes a second, then a third. David is in sin when he does this. Verse 44. "But Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Phalti, the son of Laish, which is of Gallim. Now, I'm not so sure David was in sin when he took Abigail, because his wife was already gone. She was no longer his wife, right? And go to 2 Samuel chapter 6. In Deuteronomy 24, it talks about if a woman, if there's separation, it says that her former husband may not take her again to be her wife after she is defiled. That's an abomination to the Lord. So if there's a divorce and a separation and one goes to somebody else, you should not take them back. They've already been defiled by somebody else. And again, this situation still in no way justifies having multiple wives. This is not God's commandment. This was not God's original plan. However, you see Abigail being protected in this situation. God used it to protect her. You're in 2 Samuel 6. Look at verse 14. And David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was girded with a linen ephod. The famous story where people try to say David was dancing naked, but here it says he's girded with a linen ephod, which covered this much, so still covered the nakedness. He wasn't naked, but you know the story. He's bringing back the ark. He's thanking the Lord. And of course, he's bringing his wife back also. He's getting that first wife. And here it's a matter of pride. Even though she was already another man's wife, he took her back. I don't think he should have. Look, ever since they separated for a period of time, the marriage was ruined. She ended up being with somebody else. He was with somebody else. And they had no business coming back together. And obviously God doesn't bless it. Look at verse 23. Therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children unto the day of her death. The contention was so sharp that they didn't come together and God didn't bless the marriage. Go to 2 Samuel chapter 12. Jump ahead to chapter number 12. Again, people love to point to David and say, well, clearly it's okay. But David only had problems. The more wives he had, the more problems he had in life. If he had stuck with the first one and not left her, not hearkened to her voice when she said go, instead he should have stayed or brought her along, then it would have been blessed of God. But that's not what they did. And again, it created this environment of greediness. And now we look at Bathsheba in 2 Samuel chapter 12, look at verse 5. And David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, as the Lord liveth, the man that hath done this thing shall surely die. This is where Nathan the prophet says, gives him that analogy of he took this lamb that wasn't his. And of course David says, hey, this guy should die. Verse 6, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. And Nathan said to David, thou art the man. Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I anointed thee king over Israel, and I delivered thee out of the hand of Saul. He pointed it right back at him. You're the guy that was greedy and hurt people because you're greedy. In verse 8, he says, and I gave thee thy master's house and thy master's wives unto thy bosom, and gave thee the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would, moreover, had given unto thee such and such things. Now here he's saying he would have given him more. If the houses and the wives weren't enough, I would have given you more. And again, God is not saying here it's okay to have a bunch of wives. Some point to this and say, see, God condones polygamy. But that's not what's happening. God's pointing to the blessings he already had. God was probably saying, hey, I was long-suffering and merciful when you took multiple wives, and I've given you all these physical blessings, and yet you're still greedy, and you hurt the innocent. And God was really just trying to show his judgment here. He says, if you needed more, I would have given you more. Instead, he decided to take a wife that didn't belong unto him. And that's what the Mormons are known for. Joseph Smith was famous for that. The new converts would come in, they would move into the camp, and then he would eyeball their wife and say, well, we need to send you on a missionary journey to those Indians. Boy, them Indians are dangerous. We're going to send you to go out to the Indians and convert them to Mormons. And then what happens? This guy dies. Whether it really is by Indians or not, he ends up being killed. And then Joseph Smith just takes another wife. And he says, there's another one for me. Now that's greedy. The Bible's clear. We should not multiply wives. It should be one man, one woman, and we can't point to David's greed and justify polygamy. That's not okay. And I think at this point when he went after Bathsheba, it's clear he didn't appreciate Abigail that he did have. She preserve. I mean, she was a good woman from what the Bible tells us. He didn't appreciate Michal. And what happens? Well, Solomon learns his wicked ways, and that is eventually Solomon's fall. It's his destruction. Look at verse 9. Wherefore hast thou despised the commandment of the Lord, to do evil in his sight? Thou hast killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and hast taken his wife to be thy wife, and hast slain him with the sword of the children of Ammon. He said, you took his wife, you're guilty. Verse 10, now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me, and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. The people that point to this chapter to say that God is okay with multiple wives, of course they skip this verse, where the sword never departs from his house, where David's own children are killing their brothers and sisters. That's the result of polygamy. Verse 11, thus saith the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of the sun. For thou didst it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel, and before the sun. David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said unto David, the Lord also hath put away thy sin, thou shalt not die. Howbeit, because by this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also that is born unto thee shall surely die. I want you to understand this. When we as Christians step outside of God's law, we give the enemy an opportunity to blaspheme. When a Christian couple separates, whether it be just for a season or if they get divorced, it's an opportunity for the devil and the unsaved world to point and say, look at those Christians, look what they're doing. I want you to go to 1 Corinthians 7 and we will finish with that. 1 Corinthians chapter number 7. David had plenty of wives, which was already breaking God's law. God was merciful on him. And what happened because judgment didn't come immediately? Well, he got greedy. And he took somebody else's wife, and God came to the point of, okay, now you will destroy your own household through your greed and through your lust. And he gave the enemies of the Lord opportunity to blaspheme, and the innocent child died. That's what happened with David's sin. And anybody that would look at Abraham or Jacob or David or any other example and try to justify polygamy, they're not reading the whole story. They're not starting with Genesis chapter 1. They're ignoring what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 19. God's plan is you have one man, one woman, for life, and He blesses that. There's no shame in that. Hey, there might be problems in life. Life is hard. But you know what? God blesses you in ways for staying together that we will never get. It is so important for us as men to value our women. They are not cattle. They are not horses. They're not like gold and silver. This is a precious gift from God, and we must value them and honor them and protect them. It's like a delicate flower you don't want to get hurt. That's your job, man. Protect that woman. You're in 1 Corinthians 7. Look at verse number 1. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. In other words, if married men, if a lady comes to you and says, oh, give me a hug, you say, no, not doing it. Hey, single men, if a married woman says, oh, give me a hug, you say, nope, not doing it. Verse number 2. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. You know, they say in America the divorce rate is actually going down. There's not as many divorces anymore. Do you know why? Whoredoms! Because everybody's sleeping around. They don't value what God's given them. They don't value their body, their purity. They defile themselves. That's wicked. That's disgusting. It's filthy. It's nasty. Of course, marriage is on the uprise. Divorce is going down. Why? Because everybody's sleeping around. They're committing fornication. So God says, so that you don't commit fornication, I have something that will help you. It's a spouse. Whether you're a man or a woman, God wants you to have a spouse and be blessed and stay with them. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. That do benevolence there, that is physical love, and that is love that is, I believe, spoken and demonstrated in many ways. This is the marriage relationship, staying together physically, but also benevolent, loving, caring, and demonstrating it through your heart and your words. Verse 4. The wife hath not power over her own body, but the husband. Ladies, you don't own your body, the husband does. And likewise, also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. The man has the right to tell a woman, I think you need to button that shirt up a little bit more, but you know what? So does the lady. My wife and I joke around about that. One time I had my shirt unbuttoned. I said, okay, I'm ready to go. And she said, Mr. Fannin, this is my body. You're going to button up your shirt. And we were having a good time joking about it. And then she said, I need a big old gold chain just to add a little humor to the situation. You know, if you're going to leave your shirt unbuttoned, you might as well look like a Guido, right? But what are you saying? Listen, your body belongs to your spouse. Why? Because these two become one flesh. She is yours, but you are hers. Don't share either one. Not to be shared with anyone. Last verse, verse number 5. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time. He's saying, give that due benevolence, give that due love, both physical and mental and verbal. Give these things. You got to take care of it. But there is a time maybe where you fast from a relationship for the sake of growing spiritually, but it can only be for a time and with the consent of your spouse, because your body belongs to them. Defraud ye not the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. He's saying, don't be unstable in the relationship that God has designed for marriage. Don't stray from that relationship, because if you do, you're defrauding and you're opening the door for the devil to tempt you. And people, maybe as marriage goes on, the relationship that's physical doesn't always happen like it should. But God's warning us here that we need to have that to avoid fornication, so we don't defraud each other, so we don't lose our love, and so we're not tempted by the devil. I think all these people, you think about David in the wilderness. What happened? Well, he's out there alone, and Satan tempted him, right? And he took 2 wives while he's out in the wilderness, right? You think about all these situations where people will point and try to justify polygamy or polyamory or whoredoms or adultery, and it's not okay. Jesus said, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and for this cause shall a man leave father and mother, and shall cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Listen, if you're married, you better fight for your marriage. Don't listen to Michael when she says, maybe you should run. Maybe you should go for a time. Listen, God wants you to stay married. Single men and women, God wants you to be married. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for these words. Lord, help us to